Welcome to the Women in Safety podcast. This is a show that provides a supportive space for women in safety careers. We break down the barriers and provide opportunities for growth. Make sure to hit that subscribe button to be notified of new episodes and join us. Here's your Women in Safety podcast host, Tamara Paris.
So welcome, Kathy. I'm very excited to have you on our Women in Safety podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Tamara.
So some people in our audience might know who you are, Kathy, and some people might not. I know that the topic we're going to be chatting about is ESG and human capital. And I'm not even going to try to explain it. I'm going to leave that up into our discussion today. But before we started, can you just give like a little bit about who you are and what you do for our audience?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for that opportunity. My background is started in chemistry, ended up understanding risk and how to manage risk in my career, working with multinational companies literally across the world. My world is about identification, assessment, measurement, looking at ways to manage health, safety, and well-being for companies and really assisting them as a trusted advisor. I mean, that's what I do today. I'm an influencer. I'm somebody that really tries to work with the company where they are, understanding their business environment, their reality, in order to understand why people are so important and why the environment and managing environmental impacts are so important. So my background, spans many years, involvement in ISO 45001 as a US delegate. I'm part of the National Academies of Science, working on the risk profile in the Gulf of Mexico, post-Macondo. I am very active in the world of this concept of ESG sustainability and human capital. I've been the former chair of the Center for Safety and Health Sustainability, which is where we said that at the end of the day, how could you be a sustainable company when you have 42, and that was part of our research, 42 different fatalities across your company, and you are considered one of the world's 100 most sustainable companies. So we set out to change that criteria. So I was part of that. And right now I co-chair the Human Capital and Occupational Health and Safety. It's a project group spearheaded by the Capitals Coalition, which is a global entity, nonprofit that is looking to really create value around health and safety, in our case, in this whole world of human capital, and the world that majority of the world lives in capitalism. And we're going to talk today about stakeholder capitalism, which is starting to tie some of this together and be a true driver of ESG, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, ESG, sustainability, and human capital.
Yeah, and that's where I'd like to kind of kick it off, is to kind of really just break it down for those who are listening with us today to really understand what is ESG and what is human capital. Because for a lot of it's new terminology, and it's just concepts that we're not familiar with. So I'll leave it to you to share that a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you for that. This is, as you know, is one of my favorite topics because it's so real and so relevant for every safety and health professional that is going to be listening to this podcast. So when we think of ESG, so that's just terminology that the investment community relates with, and it's ESG impact. So that means environmental, that means social, and that means governance impacts that a company has on all its stakeholders. So when we think of environmental, right now in the world, it's about decarbonization, it's about biodiversity, it's about greenhouse gas emissions. In our world, many of us also day to day manage the environmental impacts in our company. So any kind of air emissions, but also looking at waste, looking at water and water use. So it's this idea of what impacts an organization has, right? So that's the environment. And frankly, that's what's getting all the press right now. We'll talk about later. But there's also the social side. And what the social side means, it's about relationships. And I think this is the easiest way for us to put our head around what the social part of ESG or sustainability, because each one of these are a component of a sustainability. So the social side and the social impacts of this world basically includes relationships with your customers, relationships with your employees, with your workers, with your suppliers, with government, with your investors, if you're publicly traded. And if you're a privately owned company and you're looking for a merger or acquisition, and you are creating debt in your company, those investors apply to you as well. And then communities and society in general. So how does this all fit together, and what kind of impacts your company has? And let me give you just a really simple example. When we think about the social side, when we think about people, employees working in a company, right now, the world has just been blown apart, right? We are in a VUCA world. It's volatile. It's a world where it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And if we don't know that in terms of COVID-19, you've been in a rock, under a rock for a very long time, the past 2.5 years. But that has created a world of work that has completely changed, and we are never going back. No matter what anyone wants to say about going back to normal or even new normal, we and the world continues to change, and that's what this VUCA concept is all about. So when we think about workers, we think about employees, the world has changed. And in terms of the social contract between the employer and between the employee has also changed. And we can see it both in many parts of the Western world, specifically in Canada, UK, and the United States, where the pay wages are actually rising. And that's because of competition. That's because of the lack of workers, so shortage of labor. We see this in our supply chains. If you're trying to buy a new car, or you're trying to purchase anything that requires lithium, which is required for batteries, or some of the metals that are required for a lot of our technology, you can't get it. And this ties in this concept of what kind of impacts the company has not only on their people, their health, their safety, and their well-being, but also what dependencies do they have on their people. And these shortages and the lack of the ability to actually have a product or service or provide the service for your customer impacts all these different stakeholders, which we'll I'm sure get to talk to in just a few minutes. But the governance side, I think, is really important. And most health and safety people we don't get, in many cases, unless you're at the highest levels, to the real core of what governance is. So if I break it down, governance, if we think about how we manage the risk for safety, health, and environment, that is governance. It's the actual mechanisms in which risk, and this could be business risk, could be financial, could be health, safety, could be quality, it could be asset management. It's how does an organization actually manage their risk? So think about this. This is in our DNA of understanding governance, because we do this when we integrate management systems, safety and health management systems. That is a governance process, if you will, just breaking it down, trying to make it simplify in our world, of how we actually contribute to the governance of managing risk in the organization. So if I blow that up just a little bit further and talk about other points of governance, that can include crisis management, which we tend to get involved in as safety and health professionals. But that also includes assuring that corruption doesn't happen in the organization, wherever they are in the world. And that means having proper policies, codes of conduct. How do they work with their suppliers? On the board, do they have an inclusive board? All of those things are considered part of governance. And there's many, many other things. And tomorrow, you and I talked that I'll be supplying some resource links that will help people understand a more broader, because there's a lot more examples.
Oh, yeah.
we just wanted to kind of touch
So,
base and kind of give a perspective.
so if we were to give this in a nutshell, what we had is the environmental, social, and governance. And for the environmental, it's really about how is our company impacting the environments that it's touching, it has touch points with. So when we're looking at social, it's about relationships. And so we're looking at the social impacts our company, our organization has on its customers, on its employees, on different stakeholders and contractors, as well as the community that comes in touch with that organization. And when we're talking about governance, it's really how does our organization manage risks? Is that correct? Am I getting that right?
Two things I have to add because we need
Okay.
to blow things up. So it's impacts the company has on ESG. Yes, you're absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
It's also what dependencies do they have that? Because at the end of the day, we're looking at what value does managing these environmental, social, and governance impacts have on company. So it's not just what does a company do, but also those aspects, environmental, social, governance. What dependencies does a company have on those impacts?
Okay. Okay. So I'd like to move us into kind of understanding human capital. Can you share with us off the top, what is human capital? What is this concept?
So when you think of capital, so you got to think of capitalism. And that's the world we live in, at least in the Western part of the world. And to understand this terminology, the financial world looks at the concept of human capital. So there's 5, 6 different capitals that create value in a company, and the investment community and financial community look at that and determine whether they're going to purchase those assets or invest in the company. So human capital, in addition to manufacturing capital, intellectual capital, natural capital, human capital, and social capital, and we'll talk about human capital, are all part of capitalism, right? They create value for a company. So when we think of human capital, we're thinking of people. And so, don't look at this as inhuman or inhumane. It's just, another word for people working in organizations. And when we talk about people, the investment community typically talks today about employees, but that notion is expanding to workers, meaning workers in supply chains, workers in your entire value chain. So human capital basically is those skills, those knowledge, the abilities, the capabilities of the people working in an organization that actually help to provide innovation, creativity, productivity in order to impact the performance of a company.
So in a nutshell, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, because that's why we're here, we're learning about this, is human capital is we're looking at the people in the organization and what they're contributing as far as skills, knowledge, experience, training, etc., in order to invest in the organization and make it succeed. Am I getting that right?
So if you have that notion of human capital, if you have those people that are able to contribute, are able to be creative, right? New products, new services, be innovative, and be productive, that impacts the performance of your company. All of those things come together to create better performance. It's not just getting widgets out the door, right? It's creating new widgets that are much more exciting to your customers, and that are going to increase your market share, that are going to be interesting from an investor perspective, right? Because they're the ones that, the shareholders are the ones that determine whether or not you're going to continue in business long term.
And in my research, when I was looking into this, there's actually different types of human capital. Can you share what they may be talking about when they were talking about different types of human capital?
So I'm not sure, where you read, but when you think about human capital, it's really what I've been explaining. So these various aspects, if you will, of human capital. So creating innovation, looking at productivity results, based on a company's care and feeding, for lack of a better word, but how they engage, right? How they look after their people. And this notion of human capital is something that is really starting to evolve. And part of this is because of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And you think about people and human capital in an organization, and that falls underneath the social aspect. And the social aspect and impacts and dependencies around ESG. So it really does all come together. And when we think about this in the context of sustainability, it's looking at an organization that can be sustainable over time. So if you're taking care of your people are going to take care of your company. And that's really the notion of those. It's like there's really one concept of human capital, but there's different aspects that create value that impact positive performance for your company. Hopefully that was helpful.
It was. And can you share maybe some examples of how does human capital affect organizations?
Absolutely. Let's break down this pandemic a little bit more, right? The world has changed. The world of work has changed. And today, because of the pandemic, in workplaces, we're talking about mental health. And before that, at least I think Canada is better, but at least in the United States, not at all. UK, Europe, yes, much more. But now in all companies, we're talking about mental health because people are working remotely. And so therefore that is impacting them on many, many different ways, not just their work, which is what it was before, so production and things like that, but also they're having to manage their children at school, home, not literally not homeschooling, but homeschooling, but making sure that the technology is working in their house, the Wi-Fi, this whole virtual contactless world is changing. So that is like one aspect is mental health. And we've I mean, even in the grand scheme, Tamara, in the grand scheme, the idea of health really has never been at the forefront. It's always been safety, but now health, right? And mental health, both physical and mental health, are really coming to the forefront. So I would say that from the pandemic is a really important change.
Yeah, because that's going to be really impacting how people are capable of doing their jobs,
Exactly.
both socially, emotionally, right?
Yes.
As well as building your knowledge.
Yes.
Because we're not doing those things like we were before.
Yes. It's a concept of being fit for work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But fit for work isn't just physical anymore. It's also, mental well-being. And, that's another piece that has really come into the fore is the concept of well-being. And if I could just take a second here, the concept of well-being is not just the absence of disease. It is truly fulfillment. And so when we talk about this world of work that has changed and this concept of remote working, just an example of this was a group of software workers for Apple. When Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, said, we know that you want to come back to work, and so we're going to open up the workplace for 3 days a week. And a group of 80 of some of Apple's top performers got together and said, Tim Cook, we want you to understand that we have been productive for a whole year in a pandemic. We have learned to manage our work life balance, and we don't want to go back to that. We want that balance. We want to continue to have that balance. And things kind of progressed, and in terms of Apple, people are working from home, and that every workplace is really experiencing this, both in the ups and downs of the coronavirus, and its its impacts on people. So I mean that's another area where this concept of workers, employees really do have the upper hand, and this is part of why ESG is important and why the various stakeholders are looking, because it impacts all of us as consumers, and if you're a B2B customer.
And I mean, really, I think in the long term, it's going to increase the quality and value of the human capital when people do have a sense that they have more balance, that they're appreciated for what they're bringing to the table. I think we're seeing a shift in a new era of the workforce because people are being more candid, they're being more transparent, they're actually wanting to improve their emotional being, right? So that in turn will have people re-energized to be more productive
Absolutely. And innovative, right?
and innovative. Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, for business, tying it back to the people with the business, businesses won't survive unless they have innovation.
Right.
Examples, right? Like Kodak.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you don't innovate, you basically are going to be obsoleted.
Yeah, well, and it's creating a workforce that has a space where they feel they can be more creative. And also people are leaving companies where they weren't getting that satisfaction. And I think that was a wake-up call. They're calling it the great resignation, right?
Yes, that's
And that's
exactly right.
because those companies weren't valuing their human capital.
Yes. But the thing that has changed is the fact that because there's a labor shortage, that
Yeah.
means, that law of supply and demand. So that's why the workers, employees have an upper hand. So they actually can find better work.
Mhm.
And so therefore the talent wars are on. And so, companies are really focused on what are we doing for our people?
How is human capital the key to a successful ESG strategy?
I think it's important to break it down, even though
Mhm.
it's all integrated.
Yep.
Everything, E, S, and G, all are integrated. If you don't have good governance, you're not going to be able to have a good strategy and plan for environment or for relationships or your people. So I want to just state that it's all integrated. But when we talk about people,
Yeah.
can't do any of this without people. So there's that KPMG study that just came out at the end of last year. I think it was August, September of last year. And in this, they really tied, because right now everything's about the environment. What are you doing to identify, assess, manage, and measure? And what's happening is you can't do this without the people. The people are the decision makers. The people actually, which I thought this output of the report was really interesting, because I'm such an organizational change person. That's what I do in companies. I go in and figure out how best to get things moved in the direction that the organization wants to move in, and safety, health, and environmental from my perspective. But one of the things that this study came out with was that people are going to be the greatest resistors of this change, of energy transition, of moving towards decarbonization, which is part of the energy transition, greenhouse gas emissions, because there's such a move in this VUCA world to technology, AI taking over. And in this move, there is concern by people, organizations, human capital, that they're not going to have a place in it. So part of this is in this whole world of ESG. And so one of the strategies is to make sure that people are taken care of, is to involve them. And my favorite word and the best word that any organization can get in their DNA is engagement, getting people involved in the decision making. And many companies kind of freak out. They're like, well, they don't have the knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I'm like, yes, they do.
Yeah.
And they do, because they're the ones with boots on the ground. They are doing the work, and they know the best way, the most productive way to work. They also know how to bypass all of those guards and things like that, because they don't allow them to be productive. So if you get their input, they can be part of this change. They can see that they actually will have a place. It might require some upskilling, right? Some retraining, but there will be a place. And then bigger picture for that individual, with this upskilling, with this retraining, they might not need to stay with their company. They have just built out themselves as a greater capital, a human capital, for anywhere they want to go. So opportunities for them are also created. But unless we start having these conversations, and it can be in the frame of ESG or not. And this is really important because they're not mutually exclusive. They can come together, but they can also, I mean, you've got a whole world in human resources that's all around human capital management. They just call it talent management instead, right? Because that's that stakeholder lens. So you can see how there's that interconnectivity, there's that linkage, but it's an essential part of ESG.
And if you were to allow yourself to break out of that mindset that other people don't have the knowledge and experience, then you're moving towards, creating that workplace because people trust each other, they respect each other, they understand. If I go out of my own little circle, I can actually get people with deeper knowledge in certain areas that they can then make things more robust. Because a lot of times the people that aren't being in the conversation, they become, that goes back to the emotional piece, right?
Yes.
Because they become resentful that they're viewed as lesser than.
Spot on. That's absolutely spot on. And Tamara, one of the things we haven't really brought into that human capital discussion is concepts of inclusion and diversity, equity, inclusion, wages, living wages. I mean, depending on where you are in the economics, but having proper wages for the work that's being done. And then because we've really focused, because our audience is health, safety, and well-being, but there are other aspects of human capital, as you're touching on, that are equally as important, and frankly, are being more focused upon by some of the stakeholders. But at the end of the day, people are at the core of every thriving business, and if they're not safe, they don't feel, they are not healthy, and they don't have a sense of well-being, mental health and physical health, they're not going to be able to contribute, as we've been saying all along, to that bottom line, to that corporate performance. So I don't know. I always say, people are the glue that sticks on all of this. They're the decision makers.
Well, and if like what you were saying with governance is how we manage health and safety, how are we managing risk? If we're doing it in a bubble, then we're not going to be able to identify what the risks are. And the key thing also that needs to be brought into the discussion, Kathy, is that as health and safety professionals, we're supposed to be eliminating first and then mitigating. And so if we have those different stakeholders in the conversation, they could actually help identify, like if you've got the individual who's doing the work with the designer and they're having a conversation, just think about just even the setup of a workplace could be done so differently. Like, and I'm thinking about that at the commercial level in a retail store, where the staff are saying, why would anybody design it this way? Right? Of course, we need to wear PPE to clean the oven because they're choosing ovens that need harsh chemicals. Why can't we get an oven that's self-cleaning?
Exactly.
Right? And that's
yes.
And then when you go up and you talk to the people who source stuff and say, well, is it possible to get something like a self-cleaning oven? They're like, oh yeah, that's possible. We can get that. So it's again, getting those brains together, right?
Yes, eliminate. And you touched perfect examples because that's engagement 101, right? And then when you take that and you create policies that are based on, right, the input of those people. And I'll give you a great example. I'm working in the steel industry. In the US, we have this, they're called, it's the Voluntary Protection Program, but this idea of like risk. And each types of hazards or risks in an organization, there were teams created in this particular company. And so they had 100% of their people involved in one of these teams.
Oh,
and
great.
So there was a team, so there was a team around crane safety. There were teams around ergonomics. There were teams around industrial hygiene. There were teams around workforce violence. I think there's like 30 plus different teams, and they did just exactly what you were talking about. So these teams actually were, each one of the teams determined what the policy was going to be around that particular hazard or risk in the organization. And there was a team around conducting audits. what the policy was going to be, who would be involved, and what would they do, with the findings and that kind of thing. And then they actually developed inspection check sheets,
Yep.
audit questions and things, not for them to do, but for the auditors and the people in the various departments to actually use those inspection sheets. Point being, they were also given carte blanche to be able to go and actually do research. So they'd go to the regulators, they'd go to best practice companies to find out what are their ergo practices. And so to your point, whether it's boots on the ground or whether it's policy development, it's having those people involved because, as you said, they are the ones that know how to do the work well and most productive and safe.
So it's using your human capital to work smarter, not harder.
Yeah, I love it. That's exactly right. That's nice.
So the next area I wanted to kind of dive into is, why is ESG and human capital so important to our company, to the stakeholders, to our teams? Can you break that open for us?
Absolutely. And I'm going to go reverse order. For safety and health professionals, we need to know the business environment in which we're operating. At the end of the day, if we know what our business leaders are thinking, we can align all of our strategies with the business. Purpose, which we haven't talked at all about, but what the purpose of a company is, what are the goals and objectives, right? What's their end game? And everything we do in terms of safety, health, and environmental management needs to align with that. We need to align with that in order to get the budgets we need, right? If we need to install a new ventilation system, we need to be talking about the health side of our business and how will that impact the people? How will that impact the environment, depending on what kind of scrubbers and whatnot are associated with those ventilation systems. So all of this, if we can speak in the language of our leaders and the language of business and help them with that context, because we are starting to understand the context, there won't even be any question. The budget, you'll get what you need and probably ask, what else do you need? So that's from our perspective. So when we talk about our teams, right, when we talk about innovation, we talk about creativity, and we talk about the productivity, they are fulfilled in their work and you get the best out of them. You get that discretionary energy. The research says that an employee gives about 80% to their job normally, but when they love their job, that discretionary energy that they decide that they're going to give could be 100%, 150%. So that piece in terms of teams and in terms of us as health, safety, and environmental professionals. And we think about our companies and why is this important for them? It's important for them because the stakeholders are saying it's important. So customers want to work with companies that have a purpose. And when we say they have a purpose, companies that are focusing on these ESG impacts that we're talking about. And you'll hear Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock is most of their customers are institutional investors, so they're looking at long-term investments. Why is that important? Well, ESG is about long-term vision, purpose, strategy, and action planning. And so what BlackRock, and mind you, BlackRock is $10 trillion US in assets under management. That's a big influencer in the markets, right? And that's global. But it's not just BlackRock. But Larry Fink, and every year he sends a letter to the CEOs, and his letter just came out literally last week. And in that letter, he talks about companies that manage their business and they focus on purpose. And in my Kathy Seabrook language, I talk about true north, which I'll tell you in just a second. But this concept of focusing on your purpose, and purpose including ESG impacts. So managing them, right? Identify, again, what we safety and health professionals know so well: identification, assessment, measurement, monitoring, management of ESG impacts, of which safety, health, and environment are part of that. And if we begin to understand what our business leaders are saying that the stakeholders are asking for, customers' expectations, supplier expectations, there are suppliers that are also having to report into those investors on what they are doing. And one of the things is They want, remember the social side relationships, they want to have business relationships with companies that are on purpose. Now, in the CEO letter, I thought it was very, very interesting because Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, basically talks about that this is stakeholder capitalism. We're not doing this because, we're environmentalists. We're doing this because in the world of capitalism, this makes sense. Well-run companies make sense. And for us as safety and health professionals, we know this because we know a management system, a well-run operation that identifies and assesses and continually improves, right? The risks, the risk profile. And to your point, Tamara, about eliminating those hazards, and they can get to that point. Those are well-run companies. And that's why this is so important to the business. It's important to the business leaders. It's important to us as safety and health professionals. And it's important to the teams, the people in the organizations in which we are operating.
So Kathy, you mentioned a letter that Larry Fink, is that correct, of BlackRock wrote. Can we dive a little bit deeper into that? Because I probably our audience isn't quite aware of it. And I'm going to put that on the episode page also so people can get to the link. But can you share with us what is that about and what's important about it? What should we be considering?
Yes, this is the letter that comes out on an annual basis, and it's Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, and BlackRock is 10 trillion assets under management, so they have pretty good influence, if you will, in the markets around the world. He writes these letters to the CEOs to let them know what the investment decisions that their company and the influencers and influences that they're going to be looking at as they determine what companies and what assets they want to own. This meaning BlackRock owning the assets. So why is this important is what we should be asking. And in my world, I've really had to bridge the gap. I've had to really understand this concept of not just capitalism, but what do these markets mean? And how are these markets driving us, safety and health professionals? And how can we connect and bridge that gap from our knowledge to our business leaders in our companies and our organizations, their knowledge and their expectations, and the stakeholders that are driving that knowledge and expectations. So in this CEO letter, over the past 3 years, Larry Fink has been focused, and BlackRock, it's not just Larry Fink, it's the company, the organization, has been focused on ESG, sustainability. And currently, sustainability, the major focus of most of the markets is on environmental impacts. And that just is where we are right now today. But last year and this year, he talked about people. He talked about human capital specifically, and talked about the impact of people on talent management on an organization. In the areas that I've been talking about, human capital. So knowledge, skills, ability, creativity, innovation, the ability to be productive, all of those things and how they impact the performance, right? The actual well-being and performance of an organization, because that's what those investors are looking at. And they're not looking, in terms of Larry Fink's letter, they're not looking at short-term returns, which has been the markets forever, right? For decades. It is now long-term. And his institutional investors are investing, because they tend to be pension funds. Yeah. They're investing for a long period of time for their the people that eventually will be pensioners. So in his work and in his letter, it's important for us to understand this is the business environment in which our leaders and our organizations are operating in. And that environment, just like everything in the VUCA world we've been talking about, in this environment, ever changing. So last year, more emphasis on environment. This year, same emphasis on environment, but also really pulling in the human capital and the social side, and what we call social capital for organizations to be not just looked at and just reported on, but how are they managing it? Yeah. Right? What's the strategy? What are the risks? What are the opportunities for the organization? Hopefully
And
that's
doesn't he also call on saying that companies need to be clearer about how they're managing sustainability, and he brings in looking at like diversity in the workforce. He talks about understanding the company's role in the society at large as well. Like he really dives in to a lot of areas.
when we talk about human capital, these are the things that we've been talking about in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, looking at living wage, and looking at wages in general, as well as looking at the health, safety. And he, in his letter, talks about the concept of mental health. That just hasn't been in the discussion until the pandemic happened. So again, yes, absolutely. And also tying into this concept of purpose, right? And purpose in my world, it's true north. It's where, people, their health, safety, and their well-being and environmental impacts are all if they're well managed, they create value for the company. And in creating value, that impacts performance and also impacts your stakeholders. And again, it's all stakeholders, not just shareholders.
Yeah.
That's the other point, that over the past couple of years, the U.S. Business Roundtable, which is 181 CEOs in global companies, so throughout the world, basically said that we need to be looking at all of our stakeholders, not just our shareholders. And that is the purpose of a company's purpose, meaning value for your stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And that is new thinking as of about 3 years ago.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting. I'm glad that you took the time to share with us this type of document that we may not come across on our own. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. My pleasure. The rising tide raises all ships. So, I always feel that that's my role, is to whatever I learn to, share it out so we can all have, safer, healthier workplaces for all people in the world.
So thank you, Kathy, for joining me. We are at the end of this session for this episode, but we are doing a series. And so tune in to join us for the next session that we'll be talking about what is the role of the health and safety professional in ESG. But before we go today, Kathy, is there anything else that you wanted to leave our audience with?
Yes, I want you to be curious. Find out about your company. Go, now that you've learned what ESG is and why it's important, go find out your company, or if you're a consultant, or if you're in any kind of capacity where you're actually working with companies, find out where that company is on ESG. And so go to their annual report. Go to their, if they have a sustainability report or a corporate social responsibility report, go to it. Find out, just Google the company and ESG, and you're going to get a lot of information. You will mine out information about your company that will help you in our next episode when we talk about your role as a safety and health professional.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to our next discussion on this topic for this series. Thank you again.
Thanks, Tamara.